This edition of Mac Voices is brought to you by Squarespace. Everything you need to create an exceptional website. For a free trial and 10% off your first purchase on new accounts, go to squarespace.com/MacVoices and use the discount code MacVoices5. Welcome to the MacJury on MacVoices. This is the home of truth, justice, and the Macintosh way. I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, WWDC is coming up in a few weeks. I thought it'd be interesting to gather up some real live iOS programmers or people that know a lot more about iOS than I do and probably than you do, and let us tell them what they want, what they need, what they expect to be in iOS 7, and what should be coming from Apple in those areas. So it should be a good discussion. I'm glad you're here to join us. Let me introduce you to who you're going to be talking to. First up, and new to the MacJury, although you've seen him on Mac Voices, Mr. John Brayton of Golden Hill Software. John, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Chuck.
So what does Golden Hill do?
I have my flagship product is a Mac app called CloudPull, and CloudPull backs up your Google account to your Mac. It backs up Gmail, Google Contacts, Google Calendar, Google Drive, and at least for the next couple months, Google Reader. It backs that all up to your Mac.
Great, great. Always a good idea. As much as we like things in the cloud, it's nice to have control of them, just in case.
That's the idea.
And someone who is not at all a stranger to any of the Mac Voices shows, Mr. Mapp Newburgh from TidBITS and authorship and all kind of nerdy stuff.
Yes, I think I'll hold up a copy of my book here. This is the second edition, but there's a third edition, iOS 6, okay? And of course, when iOS 7 comes out, I'll have to have one called iOS 7. So this is a programming book. I'm sorry that I'm showing you the second edition, not the third edition, but I can't lift the third edition. It gained 200 more pages.
I was just going to say, give us an edge shot of that book. That's
oh, this is small. You understand, okay? This is what it used to be like.
Wow,
that's the small version.
Right. The third edition is considerably bigger.
So in other words, it's good we're talking to you now because when iOS 7 comes out, you'll go into a hole and write 500 or 600 more pages.
That is correct. Although, as you know yourself, Chuck, I enjoy talking about it even while I'm doing it. We've had some conversations from deep in that hole.
Yeah, and you're not passionate about it at all, Matt.
No. I couldn't care less about iOS or any of those things.
It shows. It shows. Well, guys, I'll let you tell me where you want to start. And John, since you're new here, I'll put you on the spot first, just because that's what we do. I'll let you pick.
Ask him to talk about WWDC. And I mean, look, it's sold out in 2 minutes. There's got to be something to say about that.
Well, the good news is I decided ahead of time not to try to buy a ticket, and so I ended up with no disappointment that I probably wasn't going to get one anyway.
Well, it's too bad because we won't get to see you there. But, John, want, need, or expectation for iOS 7? Take your pick, and we'll start there.
So I'll start with a want, and this is probably much more of something I want than something that Apple actually has a business need to do. But the biggest thing I would like as a developer is the ability to sideload apps, because from a developer's perspective, the App Store being the only way to distribute apps poses a big risk, two big risks. One is that Apple just decides they aren't going to accept your app, and then you've written an app that you can't sell. The second risk is that you end up with a critical update that you need to ship to your customers, and you can't do it until Apple gets around to approving it. And sometimes that happens quickly, and you can ask for an expedited review, but other times, even if you do ask for an expedited review, that doesn't happen so quickly. And the ability to just send somebody and send customers apps without them having to go through the App Store, that's the biggest thing I would like to see out of iOS 7. Now, I'll also say that I don't think there's a chance that's actually going to happen, but that's what I want. It's my number one wish for iOS.
And that must affect you. Do you sell out of the Mac App Store too? I mean,
yeah.
Basically, you're talking about the App Store, and this is an App Store problem in general.
Right, and I do have the same problem with the Mac App Store, but I'm lucky in that on the Mac I can give someone an update. Even if they bought through the App Store, I can at least give them an update. And one reason I focused on the Mac instead of iOS is because I think that's just it's a huge risk, and one I'm not quite ready to accept on iOS.
Okay, you sort of took my comment, and that is it realistic? But is it worth especially on the iOS, is it worth the risks, and the risks obviously being a less secure, less controlled platform? And I know Matt's going to chomp at the bit to get in here, but one of the hallmarks here of having things not be able to be side-loaded into your iPad or your iPhone is a lot more security than we see on the Android side. You think the
I would have to ask whether that's really true, though. I mean, isn't it sort of like the TSA? I mean, isn't the App Store just a bunch of kooky kabuki? I mean, they make mistakes all the time. They're not looking at your source code, Chuck. They don't really actually know what you're doing. So you could unleash any. Now you're sandboxed, and that's not going to go away. So your app can't reach out and do damage to the rest of the device. But your app can be badly written. Your app can steal data. Once I've given you permission to access the address book, there's nothing at all stopping my app from, a month from now grabbing everything in your address book and uploading it to my servers and taking that information. So anything I can get access. So I guess my point is that Apple clearly doesn't really know what the app does because they're not demanding the software. So and there are many very badly written apps. So isn't there and I'll talk more about that later. So isn't there insistence that they pass through this vetting process kind of a joke? See what I'm saying?
Absolutely. I only know as much as I read the reports from all corners of the web, and the reports are that Android has quite a bit of malware out there of one kind or another. You're talking about data misappropriation. I'll shy away from theft, but misappropriation, and it's a great point. But there's still just the fact that you, as a developer, you have to register. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's certainly better than having nothing, isn't it?
Well, if you compare it to the desktop, on the Mac, I mean, I can download. Anyone who has a Mac can download any app off of the internet and run it, and I don't see, granted, the fact that there are many more iPhones and, for that matter, many more Windows machines than there are Macs has sort of helped the Mac OS from being a target. But even so, the Mac isn't inherent. I don't think anyone. If you're going to say that, well, if you let anyone install any app they want to on an iPhone, if that poses a risk, then you have to ask, well, why that hasn't been such a risk on OS 10.
I don't have any apps that I make any money off of. Okay, I'm not making my living off of any apps. I've got 5 or 6 apps, but they're, it's a trivial amount of money. But John, that's not true for you. So for you, the relationship between you and the customer is important, and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about the way that the Mac App Store trumps on that relationship and keeps you. I mean, you gave the example of side loading, and there are also ways in which it might be sensible for you to charge, for example, and you're unable to charge in those ways because you're stuck in the whatever box the App Store puts you in.
Right. I mean, one problem I've had is that I have my app. So there are actually 3 editions of CloudPull. There is one that you download from my website. Then there is CloudPull Premium available in the App Store where you pay and then you download it. And then at some point along the line, I decided that I wanted to provide sort of a way to get a free version of it, and then pay for features later on through the App Store. So I did. So there's CloudPull Free, which is also in the App Store, and of course it's the same app, but it just backs up one account, and then if you pay for the premium features, you get support for multiple accounts and a bunch of other features. And what frustrates me is that I basically have to maintain those 2 editions of the app in the App Store just because Apple doesn't give me a way to merge it into one app. And that's just one source of frustration. The other, like I said, just delivering bug fixes in a timely manner. It's difficult.
That's the one that I go with you on. It's because I've heard that from a lot of developers, and it's because they want people to like their app. They want to be responsible developers, and sometimes things happen that they really need to get a bug fix out quick, and they can't. And it's probably, in my mind, one of the most compelling reasons to buy directly from a developer as opposed to the App Store. That, assuming it's a developer like yourself that's trustworthy, I'm going to see that bug fix very quickly should it be critical. And in the App Store, I might not, and through no fault of yours.
Yeah, it's a challenge distributing through the App Store.
Matt, how about if we go to you for want? What do you want to see in iOS 7?
Well, I come at this from 2 different perspectives. One is the perspective of a user, and as a user, I tend to think that the biggest problem on iOS is the way they've tried to be clever about sandboxing everything so that access to files is through the app that owns those files. Only one app owns those files at a time. You understand what the sandbox means? The hard disk is, let's pretend that the hard disk is literally divided up into segments, and an application only sees things that are within its segment. It can't see any other application's segments. And this is for security, and it does provide security. But the result of that is that, let's say there's a document which in theory could be opened by more than one app, like a PDF. Many different apps can handle PDFs. So we have to have some kind of handoff system. And there is a handoff system. An app that wants to be able to do this has a share button, and you press the share button and a dialog opens up saying, one of the things you can do is open in. You can open in some other app. And what the system does is the system responds to that by literally copying the thing over into the other guy's sandbox and sending him a notification. Incidentally, rocketing out of your app. As soon as you hand the thing over, you're out of there, and the other app is now taken over. So inter-app communication is all handled through the system in this very tight sandboxed way, and a document a document is seen only by the app that actually owns it, the app that has it in its sandbox. And there is no standard interface for doing this. You know how on Mac OS X there's an open dialog. And there's a finder. I can open the finder, and look, there's a list of the files. And I can open a folder. There's nothing like that on iOS. Every app that wants to provide access to a set of documents must reinvent this wheel. And so there are 10,000 different wheels. They're all, you use Goodreader. Goodreader is an example of a commonly used app, PDF app, that provides very interesting interface for manipulating documents. You know, it's holding all these PDFs, and you can rename it, and you can create a folder, you can move it to another folder. Totally unique interface. They had to make it up because Apple hasn't given them anything. So basically, there's no finder. And I think this is ridiculous. And Apple clearly thinks this is a form of simplification. But if you've ever gone into, I had to do this with my mom the other day. She had a bunch of photos, let's say 30, and she needed to get them off her computer and into the Photos app. So how did she do it? She went into Dropbox on the computer. I'm telling her how to do this on the phone. While she's doing it, you'll understand. She went into Dropbox on the computer. She put the stuff into her Dropbox. She took out the iPad. She looked in Dropbox on the iPad. There they are. Now, to get them into Photos, we had to pick one, open it, share it to Photos, come back from Photos to Dropbox, pick the next one, go back over. You couldn't select them all and say, put these all over in Photos, just like you would on the Mac. You would select them all and drag them all over, and there you'd be. So of all the things I can think of, the deep things that iOS needs, that kind of document management is the one that I'd most like to see.
Yeah, it seems to me like I appreciate where Apple's coming from in that an end user shouldn't really need access to the whole file system like you have on a typical computer. You shouldn't really need, even on a Mac, I shouldn't really need to get to the library/application support folder if I'm, an end user trying to manage my mail or my photos or something. But at the same time, even though I don't think you necessarily need access to the entire file system, it seems like they could still put a documents folder in there, and you could still have the same concept of, okay, well, it's the documents folder. They're all your documents, and it would solve that problem. Like you said, with open dialogues and save dialogues, and all your documents go there. And maybe you only put documents there if you intend to work on those individual documents with more than one application. But it seems like that model has served us well on desktop computers, and I think Apple's gone a bit too far in the other direction by saying, no more file sharing between apps. It's crazy.
Is this something? I mean, this seemed like a good idea when it started out. It certainly simplified things. It made the iPhone easy to learn. It certainly made the iPad easy to learn because you were only ever able to work on within an app. You were able to address the data that was to be manipulated by that app. You all both categorized this as a want, but I'm going to ask, is this part of an evolution that has to happen for iOS 7 or beyond to turn it into a true mobile computer or mobile device that people can use to replace their desktops?
I think, it's not a need for everybody, but I think for many people it's a need in order to use the device to replace a desktop computer.
I'm at TidBITS, and I talk a lot with Adam Engst, who runs TidBITS. And he says, I don't try to get any work done on my iPad. I can't. He takes his MacBook Air with him if he's going to get any work done. He finds the iPad useless for getting work done. And he's not just talking about the keyboard, the problem of input. He's talking about the whole overall milieu. It just doesn't let him work. And I think a lot of this is what's standing in its way. Now, I also want to touch on something that you said, Chuck, about this being easy. I think Apple needs to give a real rethink to the question of what's actually easy. My mother, who is 85, comes up with some really interesting problems with the structure of iOS. I'll give you a very simple example. Show her the iPad with an app open, and now ask, what app are we using now? Now think about how you'd answer that question, how you'd answer it. There's no way to know. Unless you recognize the gestalt of that layout, there's no way to know what app I am in now. The name of the app is not written across the status bar. If I close the app, you know what I mean? I don't learn something. I can go to that funny thing that lists all the apps across the bottom, but I don't necessarily learn what app I was just. You know what I mean? This is an obvious, simple thing that Apple needs to rethink. What app am I in now? So I think there's a lot of stuff that Apple assumes is easy, and it's not easy. It's in our way. And when I first wrote the first edition of my book, which was about programming iOS 4, I said in the intro, and I said this to you, Chuck, in some conversation that we had, boy, am I impressed with this operating system. Because what Apple did was they took Cocoa, this long evolved thing that came from Next Step years ago, before Steve Jobs came back to Apple, bringing Next with him, and sort of merged Next Step with Unix to give us OS 10. They took this thing which had this crufty, huge, complicated thing, and they said, let's keep all of this, but let's rationalize it. Let's simplify it. But not only did they adapt to a world where all you can do is touch things, but they also made it sensible. Now, iOS 5, they added a bunch of stuff, but they forgot about the sensible part. So it began to sort of grow by accretion, and it got crufty. And iOS 6 is worse. And I don't mind telling you, I've got more bugs filed on iOS 6 than on all previous systems combined, going back to iOS 3. And the reason is that it's gotten so big and so crafty, and it's grown in so many different directions simultaneously. So what do I want for iOS 7 from a developer's point of view, and from the point of view of the user too? I think Apple needs to step back and start slashing and fixing, not adding a bunch of new stuff, but rationalizing the stuff that they've got so that it makes sense. Because they've got things that don't make sense together anymore, and that's bad for everybody. So this thing has grown in this accretion, one section of the company is not communicating with the other, is my theory. I could give specific examples, but I'll stop ranting.
Okay, again, with my devil's advocate hat on, I'm not trying to play Apple here, but there's a whole philosophy behind the iPhone and the iPad and iOS, and that is that the machine, the device becomes whatever the app happens to be. Is it really that, and Matt, I'm going to just take your example, and I know you probably have a dozen and can defeat me, but I'm going to try to make my point on this one. Is it really that much of a burden to double tap the home button and have it, pop open the little list of apps and learn that the very first app in that list is the one that you're using?
No, Chuck. If you double tap the home button while you are in mobile Safari, let's say, mobile Safari will not be in the list.
Right, because it's all the other apps that are in the list. It's not the one.
That's right. You have to quit mobile Safari.
Sorry to show it. You're right. Sorry.
So, Don't apologize, because what you just said is sensible. You projected the sensible expectation onto the device. You proved my point by being intelligent about it. What you're saying should happen is exactly what should happen, but it's not what happens.
And just to take it a step further, if someone's double tapping the home button, all three of us are very familiar with double tapping the home button, but I'm not sure that it's reasonable to expect a user who might not be sure which application they're in to know that they can double tap the home button. I mean, it's already a power user feature.
John, I've at some point is it possible to design a user interface that doesn't have some learning curve? I mean, even a real little one. Is it completely unreasonable to say you're going to have to learn just a few things here?
It's not. The question of what app am I in is so basic that, or is so, it's so necessary that I'm not sure. Like, I would almost rather they said, okay, well, the application name is always at the top. Well, that's probably a bad idea for other reasons, but.
Well, that's kind of my point.
Yeah.
The idea that as soon as we start giving people information, you clutter the screen. You take away from the experience. Yeah. So, and I'm not a programmer, I'm not a developer, but I have to say, that has been one of the compelling things I think about the iPad and the iPhone is that when you fire it up, yeah, I grant you, I don't know what I'm in unless I remember. Mm-hmm. But I have a very clean screen for the most part, unless the developer has chosen to make it cluttered or busy and give me huge amounts of controls. There's no overhead from the OS.
I mean, it's a hard problem to solve. Going back to Matt's example, I mean, one thing could be what if when you did double click the home button, if it did show you what app you were in, either as if it was the most recent app or sort of on top, and then here are a list of recent apps. I mean, that's one solution. I'm not sure offhand if that's the best solution, but it would be something.
Yeah, and Matt caught me, I have to admit, because he's right. I did project. I would have sworn that was the way it was, but it's not.
You see, your point about ease of use and willingness to learn some conventions and gestures is spot on. The problem is that Apple is the one who is not willing to concede this. You know how Apple is famous for never having a manual. There's nothing to learn. You know, this goes all the way back to the beginning, 1984. This goes back to the Macintosh. You know, I've got the mouse. I can see the windows. You're going to know what to do automatically. No, you're not. There's a set of conventions, and there's a gestural language with which you are speaking to this device, and you need to learn those things. It's Apple that's in denial about those things. And I think if Apple would get out of denial about those things and say, yes, there's a universal vocabulary, it needs to be consistent across apps. This goes back to my point about how you get to your documents. All apps need a way to show you their documents in some consistent manner. Then, if they were willing to grant there's a language to be learned, then they could concentrate on making that language sensible. And my worry is that they're not doing that.
And now a word from Squarespace. Everything you need to create an exceptional website. You want to be on the web, right? You want a blog, right? Or a photo gallery, right? Or a site to sell your hand-knitted socks, right? Right. The problem is that you don't know anything about building a website. No problem. Squarespace doesn't know a thing about your socks, but they know websites and how to make them easy. With a selection here, a click there, a drag over here, and a drop over there, you suddenly have a website of your very own. And not just a website, but a great-looking website at that. You just started with one of Squarespace's many templates and went from there. Your site is up and live on the web, just waiting for someone to visit. But you're not through yet. Before you go back to knitting or photographing or whatever, you want to make the site your own, with a few design tweaks, like changing colors, maybe adding some links to those all-important social network presences. Click, click, drag, drag, done. And the only problem you have now is that they want you to build their website. Again, no problem. Just tell them to do what you did. Go to squarespace.com/MacVoices and use the offer code MacVoices5. That's MacVoices and the number 5 to get 10% off your first purchase. Or you don't have to tell them. Just sign up at squarespace.com/MacVoices with the offer code MacVoices5, use their email address, build the site for them, and then turn it over to them. They will still think you're a genius, not just for building the site, but for being savvy enough to save them 10%. That's squarespace.com/MacVoices and the offer code MacVoices5 to get 10% off your first purchase. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this edition of MacVoices. I'm going to try to win 1 point during this show. It may not be easy, but I'm going to try to win one. If you're going to have full access to all the power of the iOS devices, I'm with you. You know, there has to be a learning curve. But how do you explain 2- and 3-year-olds who pick up the iPad and just by watching somebody, I mean, because at that age, nobody's teaching them anything, and yet they are quite capable of figuring out what to do. Now, it may be rote, you know, just by saying, oh, I know I have to follow this pattern to get to Angry Birds or whatever, but it seems like that we see this a lot. I've seen it personally, and it kind of surprises me how young kids, I mean really young kids, how much they can do with an iPad.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I've seen, I once saw a 5-year-old who could not read, but he could find the Netflix app, no problem. You know?
Yeah, so what does that say? Or can you explain that, Matt?
Well, I can explain it by agreeing with it. You know, none of what I'm saying is meant to detract from the sheer genius of what Apple introduced with you know, the original iOS 3. They created a world in which, even on a very small device, you can be very comfortable and get things done quite quickly. When the iPad came in, it was a computer killer. I mean, all of a sudden, all these grandmas who were afraid of computers were happy with the iPad. So there's no denying the wonderful success of what they did. Of course, having shown the way, then everybody else got to copy it, and now Apple's, you know, not alone in that world anymore. I'm just saying, now that we're approaching iOS 7, you know, and your question is, what do I think Apple should be doing? I think they should be standing back and maturing what it is that they've done in the rapid development from iOS 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 They should use 7, in my opinion, as a way of taking a deep breath and just doing a little rationalization that will keep things from getting, too far out of hand. And again, I could give technical examples as a programmer, as a developer, about where areas where they've created conflicts between different things that developers can do, and therefore made it harder for developers rather than easier for them. As I said, I've got a lot of bugs on iOS 6. What does that prove? To me, it proves they pushed iOS 6 out the door too fast. Look at the problem of the cell data use on the iPhone. I believe this is an iOS 6 problem, the well-known problem where you've got a 200 megabyte limit or whatever it is that you've got with your cell data, and everything is going fine. Usually you use 50 megabytes a month, and one day you wake up and it's used 2 gigabytes during the night, and you weren't even using the device. There's a discussion, 100 pages long on the Apple's discussion board about this. Why is that? Well, there are 2 main causes. One is, I really think there's a bug in the system. Okay, I think the system has a tendency that Apple's not granting, they're not admitting this, to fail over, where if it thinks Wi-Fi has gotten weak or has gone away, even momentarily, it'll start supplementing that from the cell data. That unless you do something very, very strong to stop it, like turning off cell data entirely. And a phone with cell data turned off is not a phone. I mean, who wants to keep going in there and turning cell data off? And point number 2 in relation to that is, a lot of apps and a lot of parts of the system that are not apps have settings that you can use to ameliorate this situation. But they're all squirreled away deep down in settings. I mean, the way you turn off cell data is you go to Settings, General, something or other. I mean, you got to drill down like 5 levels before you get to that switch that turns off the cell data. This should be right at the top. This is a very important thing to be able to do. Similarly, there's a setting for the music app that'll keep you from, if you're using iTunes Match, it'll keep you from accidentally using cell data when you start to play a song. But that setting is 3 or 4 levels down. And clearly, Apple has simply never thought about this. They've never said, hey, is this rational? Is this a helpful structure? Let's think about how we might rearrange the Settings app so that people can get to the settings that they need. That's what I mean by rationalization. They need to go over the whole thing with a fine-tooth comb in that mode.
Two thoughts. One is, I think one thing that was a mistake, in regard to settings themselves, I think one thing that was an early user interface mistake on Apple's part is saying that all preferences should go into the Settings app, because in reality, partially because most app developers don't like it, or because most customers didn't know how to get to the settings for an app, in maybe 70% of cases, you get to the settings for an app inside the app, and then for the other 30% of the apps, you get to it by going into system settings. The other thing, and this is more specific to data usage, but where data usage, on a cellular network is such a big deal, it seems like there should be a way to say, even at a high level, okay, if I downloaded 200 megs of data over a cell network last night, what was it? Was it iTunes? Was it this funky app that I downloaded? Was it, just either the name of the app or in general what it was? If you could see, okay, where is this? There's no tools to say what's using all my cellular data, and cellular data is it's important, it's precious, it costs us a lot, so we need to know what's using that data. And if it's something you can turn off, great, but you need to know what you can turn off.
Yeah, I'd like to take that ball and run with it even further. The thing that John is pointing to there is the power tools question. If I want to be a power user on Mac, I can. I can do things in the terminal. Okay, they could be really dangerous. We can't quite have that on iOS, but just hear me out. I can see things in the console. I can fire up Activity Monitor and find out who's doing all this downloading, who's thrashing my hard disk, what processes are running, how much memory they're occupying. Those could be, in the right hands, useful things to be able to know. And as someone who can get something out of knowing those things, it really offends me that there are no tools like that on iOS. I think iOS, Apple needs to to take its foot out and give us the kinds of power tools that we need to answer the specific kinds of question that John was just talking about, and many other related questions, right? What's causing my battery drain? Well, how do I know? Because I don't know what's running. I don't know anything. I'm operating without being able to see. My only recourse is to do a clean of the entire thing and slowly install apps and use my iPhone with like only 5 apps on it for a month and see whether it uses all the cell data. Okay, it didn't use any. I'll now install 5 more. I still don't know who was the evil guy who was giving me all those problems. So I really agree with what John is saying in a larger sense. That would be a great direction for iOS to go, admitting that there need to be power user tools.
And that one I can't argue with. Just as much as this device is designed for consumers and people that don't want to spend a lot of time with power user tools, if any, there need to be something in there so that people like you two can go in, improve things, and maybe people like me can go in who know just enough to be dangerous and at least try to diagnose some issues instead of having to troll through Apple's forums or call somebody for help or figure out the magic incantation. Yeah, I agree completely. Okay, so I think we may have crossed over into needs. I'm not sure, but let's shift to needs. What does Apple need to do with iOS 7 to continue the evolution? And again, we've talked about some things, but to keep up with the Androids and some of the other things that are coming out, and that can reasonably be expected to come out, and I said reasonably, in the next year. Are there particular feature sets or capabilities that you think would be beneficial to support or integrate? Matt, how about if you start this one?
My answer is I have no idea because I don't use any. I think, Chuck, you actually use an Android device, right?
No,
you don't. No. Okay, so I mean, I've never seen an Android device, so I don't know what they've got that we don't have. And of course, all these other platforms, have a right to try to eat part of the user space out there, and Apple needs to accept that it got an early lead, but it's going to have to give up some of that simply by sheer force of numbers. But I think that, maybe you'll think this is deflecting your question, because it really is. But in general, I think what Apple needs to do is listen to its developers. And that is something that there is now hardly any mechanism for it to do. Developers are the ones on the cutting edge. Developers are the ones who know what the limitations of developers are the dreamers. Developers are the ones who say, if only there was a way to do this. And see, I see this all the time because I'm on a forum and some developer is saying, how would I do this? And the answer is, well, there's no, and it could be something really simple. Like back in iOS 5 or iOS 4, it could be, that thing which they call a switch. It says on, and there's a little thing that slides to the side. How can I make that say something other than on? How can I make it be a color other than blue? And there was no way. And people came up with incredibly complicated workarounds because Apple wasn't giving them any way. And finally, having seen enough apps, I guess, where people were doing all this weird stuff, Apple said, well, that's a good idea. Why don't we just give this switch a property, which, what color would you like this switch? And now you can just do it. What word would you like over here on the left? Might not be on. What would you like to have over there? So they did eventually wake up, but it took a really long time. Okay, and this brings me back to WWDC. I remember when I was young and I used to go to WWDC. This is what WWDC was like, okay? Some dude from Apple would give a talk for 50 minutes, okay? And then the entire team responsible for developing the thing that he just talked about stood on the stage in a line, like a perp walk or a lineup from Hill Street Blue or something, you know? They're all standing there, and there's an open mic on the floor. And developers would stand up one by one and give them hell. And I mean give them technical hell. This was a technical question and answer and criticism period. All of that is gone. The whole thing has now just turned into the Oscars. You know, they stand there, they push at you whatever it is that they want to push at you. They've wasted, as far as I can tell, the last 3 months setting up these gorgeous keynote addresses with all the lettering exactly the same and all the logos exactly the same. Every word that they're saying has been vetted by their superiors and been vetted by the lawyers. So everything is totally constrained. The whole presentation goes off like clockwork, and that's it. And that's why John doesn't have to go to WWDC, and neither do I, because it's just as good an experience to stay home and just watch the videos, because going there is just like watching videos, except you're surrounded by a bunch of people with colds, and you're eating really bad food and breathing really bad air.
Tell us how you really feel, Matt. Oh, John, yeah, just say something. Don't just leave me here. Say something.
Yeah, well, to start with WWDC, I think it's a bit silly that they have, at this point, it's a bit silly that it's a conference for 5,000 developers. Whether the answer is to make it a conference for 30,000 developers or to shut it down completely, I don't know. You can make a strong argument for either extreme, but to just leave it as, well, whoever manages to sign up in the first minute is a bit insane. So that's one area where Apple needs to either, I think WWDC should either be useful for a much larger portion of the developer audience, or they should just put their efforts elsewhere. But going back to, but just in general, where Apple could listen to developers better, one is, basically there are two other ways to talk to Apple. One is using Apple has developer forums, and some of those developer forums are monitored by Apple engineers, and they respond, and that's great. But then there are other developer forums where developers post questions, and there's not an Apple representative anywhere around. Questions just go unanswered, and that to me is completely insane. The other thing is Radar, Apple's bug filing system. You know, I understand why Apple can't just open up their entire bugs database, or even the database of bugs that are filed from outside, but there are a lot of things Apple could do to make that a lot better, to make it easier and more enticing for developers to file bugs that we need to file, and provide some way of getting a response. Right now, if I file a bug and I'm the first person to file that bug, and then they fix it, I'll find out about it. But if Matt files a bug, and then I file what turns out to be that same bug, mine will get marked as a dupe, and that's fine. It should get marked as a duplicate. But when it gets fixed, Matt will find out about it, and I'll have no idea, because mine was just a dupe of his, so bug closed, and I have no idea if they ever fix it. I mean, they're just little things like that that Apple could fix. I won't say easily, but things Apple could do to make the situation better.
And John had no way to find out that it was a dupe until he was told that it was a dupe by Apple. He couldn't search the bug base. See, he couldn't look through the existing bugs. The only bugs he can see are the ones that he has submitted. He can't even find out the titles of anybody else's bugs, let alone actually see those bug reports. So he submits his bug report in the dark, okay? And then 4 months later, he's told it's a dupe. Now, it was a dupe the day he submitted it. So all that time was wasted. It's very, very frustrating.
Over on the Apple Context Machine, Brian Chaffin and Jeff Gamet had a discussion recently about near-field communications and whether it should be supported and how it should be supported and whether Apple's going to be the one to show the industry that it's done right. As I recall, there seemed to be a bit of a disappointment when the last iPhone came out that it didn't include NFC capabilities. And this is sort of my poster child, or one of my poster children, for things that everybody says, oh, you should really adapt this hot new technology. And then 6 months later, nobody's done anything with it. I mean, it may be there, and yeah, there may be some use cases, but it's certainly not, widely used. I mean, if it had been, we'd all be hearing about it and how Apple was so far behind. I mean, it reminds me of 2 years ago when 3D TVs were the next big thing. And then you go to CES this year, and you're hard-pressed to find many 3D TVs, and you're certainly not finding people talking about them. NFC or any other technologies you think that are red herrings or that are critical to Apple's future?
I agree that that NFC is a red herring. Other than people saying I'm right there with you, Chuck, in that the only time I ever hear of NFC is when someone says Android has it, therefore iOS should have it. And aside from that, I don't know what I would do with it. So, I can't think of anything else like that where people think iOS needs it, but in reality, iOS is better off without it.
Well, I don't really have a good example, but I would say that a place where Apple has excelled is in surprising ways is by onboard hardware generally. I mean, the sensors have gotten better and better, and Apple has really, I mean, an area in which iOS really got better from 4 to 5 and from 5 to 6 is the tools that they give the developer to read the sensors and in the goodness of those sensors. I mean, when I look back at some of the iOS 4 apps, I can't imagine how they were done. Even a simple thing, there's a labyrinth game where you're rolling a marble. You're looking at it. It's one of those wooden puzzles where there are barriers, and you have to roll the marble down between the barriers and not fall in the holes and get from one side to the other. It was beautifully, beautifully executed. And when I look back and say, but this ran on iOS 4, I would not. I mean, I wrote a book about iOS 4. I would not know how to read the sensors to get as beautiful a response as the programmer of that app was getting. But I would know how to do it in iOS 6, because by the time you get to iOS 6, not only are the sensors better, but Apple is giving the developers much better tools, for example, in this particular case, now Apple has a gyroscope in there, and they use the gyroscope in combination with the accelerometer to figure out the difference between something that the user did and something that gravity is doing. Well, that's fantastic, because what you used to have to do was run it through a filter that you had to write, a mathematical filter, which introduced all kinds of latency. So I would have to say that that's the area in which Apple leads, is providing simple interfaces to powerful sensor and communication capabilities. And they will continue to do well if they keep up with that kind of thing. There's some stuff which is just too insanely hard. There's a lot of things that people want to do with the cameras, for example. To write a Google Glass kind of app is astoundingly difficult. You've got to do all kinds of transforms to stick your information up on the virtual world that's being seen through the camera. See what I'm saying? They could make that kind of thing much easier by providing you with better information rather than what they do now, which is provide you with some information and then they just stop and say, well, you do the math. No, I don't want to do the math. I can't remember that math. I slept through that, I slept through my linear algebra class. Just do the math for me. So more, and I think they will. I think the more they do of that kind of thing, the more people will be able to provide exciting experiences in their apps.
Guys, we're starting to wind down on time here, and I want to get now to to expectations. What, after all the things we've talked about, what do you really expect to see, or do you have any expectations of what iOS 7 will look like or provide to developers or to customers for that matter? John, I'll go back to you for this.
I think I get the things I think are most likely are, one, I think there'll be some big announcement about how maps are much better, and maybe they will be much better, maybe not. Who knows? That's it's a tough problem to solve, but Apple needs to get better at it clearly. The other thing that I sort of put in that same category is iCloud syncing. I think Apple absolutely has to make iCloud syncing work much, much better than it works today. I think that's probably the biggest competitive risk, is that Google is great at cloud services and Apple not so much, and I think that is Apple's biggest competitive risk, and I think they know that. So I would be shocked, honestly, if there was not at least some announcement of huge progress being made on iCloud syncing being better in iOS 7 and in the next version of the macOS than it is right now.
That's a very good one. It's a very good one. Matt, how about you?
I agree with everything that John just said. I thought that was extremely insightful, and I'm really happy that you raised those points, because we neglected to mention the iCloud problem before, and I think that's we need not go into any depth, but you don't have to do much searching to find developers complaining about how badly iCloud works. There's a wonderful WWDC 2012 video, which I like to whip out when I'm feeling depressed and I need a good laugh, because what happens is, in this video, the guy says, all right, iCloud, it's really easy to use, and all you developers are really going to enjoy using it. Because you see, instead of telling people the truth, WWDC has become a kind of propaganda. You see what I'm saying? So you're going to find this really simple to use. And then he starts telling you what you actually have to do in order to use iCloud, especially if you want to use iCloud with a core data-based application. And he talks as fast as possible for the next hour, trying to prove to you that this is really easy, just getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the complexity. And you're watching this thing and just smoke is coming out of your ears. You're going, this is nuts. This is impossible. So they really need to fix that kind of thing. In answer to the question that you actually asked, I'm pessimistic. I go back to 1996 when I went to a WWDC in a tiny convention center in San Jose at the time when Apple was pushing some technologies, some developer technologies that in the end never went anywhere, with names like OpenDoc. And you got any memory of that, Chuck? Does it ring any bells?
Absolutely.
And basically, I sat there for 4 days going, these guys are lost and they're lying. And sure enough, before the next WWDC, Gil Amelio was out on his ear, Steve Jobs was back, and Apple was beginning to come back from the brink. Now, I know I'm in a minority, but to me, Apple is feeling lost, okay? The fact that they could make the mistake with the maps and that it didn't get up to Tim Cook. I mean, Tim Cook was clearly caught with his proverbial virtual pants down. And how can that be when on the developer forums that John mentioned earlier, people were screaming as loud as you can scream on a developer forum for 5 months before iOS 6 came out, saying, these maps are bad. This cannot ship. And instead, they shipped it. Why? Because I don't know, but my guess is everybody hid all the way up the line what they didn't want their bosses to know. And so Tim Cook didn't know. So, and again, same thing with iOS 6. They introduced this wonderful way of laying out your window, very powerful. The window resizes because we now have this funny long screen on the iPhone 5. No problem. This way of laying out is so intelligent that it can cope with this thing and do something really smart about the lengthening of the screen. Really great technology. Just one problem. The guys who wrote this forgot to talk to the guys over in the animation section. Because if they had talked to the guys over in the animation section, the guys over in the animation section would say, wait, you're doing what? After the developer's code finishes running, we come around to the run loop, you're performing layout, and you're setting the frames. Everyone knows you do not wantonly set frames. So what happens is you take your old animation code, you turn on this new auto layout thing, you run an animation, you crash. Okay? Animation and auto layout are enemies. Now, to me, this says hand number 1 did not know what hand number 2 was doing. Okay? This is a company that's gotten too big, it's lost its way, it's not communicating. So I'm pessimistic for those reasons. Those are the signs. I'd like to see some tea leaves that tell me any different, but that's what the tea leaves tell me on iOS 6.
Well, we have seen some changes in management since the last WWDC and iOS 6. So, you know, and certainly we're not going to lay anything at anyone's feet because that would be pure speculation. But there is some evidence that things may have tightened down and that there's a little more reason for optimism than that blatant pessimism, Matt. I hope I'm right.
I hope you're right too.
Yeah. Guys, this has been interesting. I really appreciate you both coming and sharing your perspectives. We need to do more of this on the MacJury. Is get geeky, and not too geeky, but you know, geeky once in a while. Give people a look under the hood, and you've both made it very approachable. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see. John Brayton, Golden Hill Software, goldenhillsoftware.com.
Yep.
Great. Thank you for being here. Mapp Newburgh, the godfather from TidBITS. I don't know. I like it. What do you think, Matt?
Please develop an app and buy my book so that you can learn how to do it. Do it right. Do it right. Don't do what everybody else does. Don't go on Google and Stack Overflow and just copy and paste a bunch of tutorial code, okay? Read all these pages and then you will really know what's really going on. Thank you very much.
You purist, you.
Yes, I am.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is the MacJury. We do a whole lot of this stuff on MacVoices. I hope you enjoy it. Please come back, check out everything we do. I will have links in the show notes to everything these two gentlemen do. Please check them out as well. We will get them back. Until the next time, the verdict is in. Thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for links, show notes, to subscribe, to connect with Chuck on Twitter, app.net, Google+, Facebook, and for more Apple, Mac, and tech-related shows, including MacVoices, Mac Notables, the MacJury, and the MacVoices Briefing. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com.